Design safety objectives. One of the objectives of Certification Specification 25 is to ensure an acceptable safety level for installed equipment and systems. A logical and acceptable inverse relationship must exist between the severity of the effects of a failure condition and the average probability per flight hour, such that failure conditions with no safety effect have no probability requirement. Minor failure conditions may be probable. Major failure conditions must be no more frequent than remote. Hazardous failure conditions must be no more frequent than extremely remote. And catastrophic failure conditions must be extremely improbable. No safety effect has no probability requirement. Minor failure conditions are probable. Major failure conditions are remote. Hazardous failure conditions are extremely remote. Catastrophic failure conditions are extremely improbable. This can be portrayed in a graph where each side of a line can be determined as unacceptable or acceptable for flight conditions. Probability versus severity of failure. This can be tabulated to show classification of failure conditions at the bottom of the table. For example, no safety effect has an allowable quantitative probability of no probability requirement. The effect on flight crew is no effect. The effect on occupants is an inconvenience, and the effect on the aeroplane is no effect on operational capabilities or safety. From the bottom of the table, classification of failure condition minor has an allowable quantitative probability of less than 10 to the minus 3. Its allowable qualitative probability is probable. The effect on flight crew is a slight increase in workload. The effect on the occupants is physical discomfort. The effect on the aeroplane is a slight reduction in functional capabilities or safety margins. For major, the allowable quantitative probability is less than 10 to the minus 5, with a qualitative probability of remote. The effect on flight crew is physical discomfort or a significant increase in workload. The effect on occupants is physical distress, possibly including injuries. The effect on the aeroplane is a significant reduction in functional capabilities or safety margins. Hazardous has a quantitative probability of less than 10 to the minus 7. It's extremely remote. The effect on flight crew is physical distress or excessive workload. It impairs the ability to perform tasks. The effect on occupants is serious or fatal injury to a small number of passengers or cabin crew. The effect on the aeroplane is a large reduction in functional capabilities or safety margins. Catastrophic is less than 10 to the minus 9 and is considered extremely improbable. The effect on flight crew is fatalities or incapacitation. The effect on the occupants is multiple fatalities. And the effect on the aeroplane is normally hull loss. Severity of failure classification. Minor. Failure conditions which would not significantly reduce aeroplane safety and which involve crew actions that are well within their capabilities. Minor failure conditions may include, for example, a slight reduction in safety margins or functional capabilities, a slight increase in crew workload such as routine flight plan changes, or some physical discomfort to passengers or cabin crew. Major are failure conditions which would reduce the capability of the aeroplane or the ability of the crew to cope with adverse operating conditions, to the extent that there would be, for example, a significant reduction in safety margins or functional capabilities, a significant increase in crew workload or in conditions impairing crew efficiency or discomfort to the flight crew or physical distress to passengers or cabin crew, possibly including injuries. Hazardous are failure conditions which would reduce the capability of the aeroplane or the ability of the crew to cope with adverse operating conditions to the extent that there would be a large reduction in safety margins or functional capabilities, Physical distress or excessive workload such that the flight crew cannot be relied upon to perform their tasks accurately or completely, or serious or fatal injury to a relatively small number of the occupants other than the flight crew. And catastrophic are failure conditions which will result in multiple fatalities, usually with the loss of the aeroplane. Probability of failure. Probability ranges. Probable are failure conditions having an average probability per flight hour greater than 10 to the minus 5. Remote are failure conditions having an average probability per flight hour of 10 to the minus 5 or less, but greater than 10 to the minus 7. Extremely remote are failure conditions having an average probability per flight hour of 10 to the minus 7 or less, but greater than 10 to the minus 9. And extremely improbable are failure conditions having an average probability per flight hour of 10 to the minus 9 or less.